And so it is with deep pride that I introduce our Thomas J. Dodd Prize in International Justice and Human Rights winner, a man who needs no introduction, President Bill Clinton.
Well, you won't believe what we were up here talking about. Helena said, you know, this is heavy, I'll hold it. You know how it made me feel? It's like I wanted to say, you don't understand, I'm a senior citizen. If you make me a little sicker, I'll be a better customer for you at CVS. I thank her for the introduction, and I want to thank the UConn family for welcoming us here. Thank you very much, President Herp, Provost Choi. Thank you, Glenn Matona, the director of the Dodd Center, and Representatives Courtney and DeLauro. Thank you for being here, Secretary of State Merrill. And Molly Melching, I'm glad to share the podium with you and Tostan. I'll never forget when Hillary came back from her trip to Africa, and the first story she told me was the story you heard in greater detail tonight. This is a remarkable group. They have been active members of the Clinton Global Initiative since 2007, and they do wonderful work from the grassroots up. Something I'll say a little more about it in the beginning, in a minute. I want to thank Chris Dodd. We have been friends for more than 35 years now, and I will always be grateful for every hour we've shared in common cause and occasionally on a golf course. I'll be grateful for his leadership and support during my presidency to advance human rights and peace at home and around the world, including, and he mentioned some of this, his sponsorship for the Family and Medical Leave Act, his supportive role in the Northern Ireland peace process, his unflinching devotion to human rights, justice, and peace around the world, including standing up for the International Criminal Court. That was very interesting, the effort Chris and I made trying to convince some of our colleagues in the other party that it was a good idea for us to have an international criminal court. But it was basically at the heart of the mission of the Dodd Prize and the work that has been done by this remarkable center. Tom Dodd spent a lifetime fighting oppression and promoting justice here and around the world. In addition to the work he did at Nuremberg, for which he is most famous, he prosecuted civil rights cases in the South in the 1930s. And as a member of the Senate, in the 1960s, he helped to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. He worked to give all of our children access to a quality education and good jobs. I am grateful that the Dodd Center is here to carry on the timeless message of his work. I am grateful that he inspired his children. Chris's brother Tom was an ambassador when I was president and did an outstanding job. Chris was in the Peace Corps before he entered politics. And I always knew that he would be there ready to lead any human rights or justice call. At its core, the idea of human rights is pretty straightforward. Men and women, adults and children, straight and gay, of any race and tribe, are entitled to be treated with the same dignity, to have the same opportunities, to feel the same sense of security as other people. Any lingering doubts people have about that should have been erased in 2000, when I spent $3 billion of your money to finish the sequencing of the human genome. Now, we've learned a lot. By the way, it's a pretty good investment. I noticed the other day that there have been over $900 billion worth of investments in various biotech ventures that are the direct consequence of the sequencing, which is why you should support the BRAIN projects. You should support the BRAIN project that is now underway and other biomedical investments. But as a citizen, you should think that by far the most important discovery in the human genome sequencing is that, look around this room, every non-age-related difference you can see. Your height, your body shape, your eye color, and your race, and your gender, all are lodged in 0.5% of your genome. Otherwise, we're 99.5% the same. And yet, since the dawn of time, at least since the first clans came out of caves and clashed with others over what they perceived to be scarce food or other resources, most human beings have spent 99.5% of their time thinking about the 0.5% of themselves that is different. And I'm not just talking about politics. Now, come on. How many times have you ever walked down the street and there's a store window there that's glare and you see your reflection and you think, oh, I wish I were a little taller or a little thinner or a little younger or a little this, that, or the other thing. I don't want to know how many times I have watched LeBron James play basketball and thought, if I had a body like that, I would have gone in a different line of work. Now, most of it is harmless, but a lot of it is not. And periodically, the world gets obsessed with redefining otherness outward. We want to identify who is them and who is us. And when we're insecure, we all want to return to home base, to just be with us and not with them. Therefore, in an interdependent world where divorce is not an option, we're all going to be affected by each other. Human rights is even more important because we have got to find a way to share the future on positive terms. Otherwise, we are going to share it on negative terms. The reason I was thrilled that Tostan got this award is that their whole model, working at the village level, is community. You can be a part of our community if you share our goals of mutual respect, mutual contribution, lifting everybody up. It's very important. And I was talking to Chris backstage, and I will mention one of these at the end of my remarks, but this is 20 years to the day when I came here to help open the Dodd Center. And it's also the 20th anniversary of the normalizations of our relations with Vietnam. We fought a long and ultimately unsuccessful war there. Today, they're our best ally in Southeast Asia. Why? Because they became convinced that we came there from their point of view based on a mistake of the mind and not the heart. That we did not wish to oppress them or to colonize them, and that now we wish them well. It is the 20th anniversary of the ceasefire that the IRA declared in Northern Ireland, which enabled us 3 years later to achieve a peace in Northern Ireland that still holds. It is the 20th anniversary of the slaughter at Srebrenica, which finally got our NATO allies to support my desire to use air power against Mr. Milosevic, which convinced him he should make the peace at Dayton. That peace conference started just a couple of weeks after I was here 20 years ago. And right after Pope John Paul II had said to me, I'll never forget this, he didn't have all that long to live. He said, Mr. President, I'm not a young man. I have a long memory. The 20th century began with the war in Sarajevo. You can't let it end with the war in Sarajevo. So my life has largely been focused not just by design, but also by circumstance, on trying to stop abuses of human rights and open the horizon of human possibilities. This is a troubling time because there are so many blatant examples of abuses of human rights. Most recently and most garishly by ISIS, shooting naked soldiers in the back of the head, decapitating civilians, persecuting the tiny Yazidis, one of the oldest monotheistic sects on earth, completely nonviolent, threatening the Samaritans, people that are very important to Christians around the world because the parable of the Good Samaritan is very powerful. The Good Samaritan, you will remember, was part of a sect that the ancient Jews felt no community with, but turned out to be a more loving person, honoring the best of the Jewish tradition than the people who criticized him for stopping along the road to help a person in need. They want to get rid of all of them because they're all them. We see it in Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and Ansar Din, the three major terrorist groups in Africa. We have seen it in oppressive governments throughout the world. But it's important to remember that a lot of other things are going on too. And they're never in the headlines, maybe because they're good news. This is not a generalized criticism, except of maybe us as citizens. I always respected NBC News for trying to actually run a primetime show every week on good things that were happening around the world. It's called the Rock Center, and mostly in America. People who are actually solving problems and lifting lives. It lasted one season. We did not watch it. Therefore, those of us who care about these things have to support places like the Dodd Center and Mali and Tostan and other non-governmental efforts, as well as good policy from the government. It really is interesting, I think, that for all the trouble in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia has more women than men in universities and has had for some years, that the previous king built the first coeducational university in the country and built it in a new and independent village so it wouldn't be boys and girls and men, young men and women wouldn't be subject to the kind of harassment they would get for sitting on the bench and talking together and doing normal things they would have elsewhere. Interesting that this year the United Arab Emirates replaced Norway as the country in the world spending the highest percentage of its GDP on human development and trying to lift people out of extreme poverty. Interesting that for all the problems in Africa, in this decade, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world will be African. Mostly where places where human rights have taken a front row seat, and discrimination has taken a back row seat to expanding possibility and opportunity. In other words, you're living in a world that is interdependent, where there are a lot of positive and negative forces bumping up against each other. And human rights is more important than ever, because the outcome of this contest will determine the world our grandchildren live in. And every one of us, in some way or another, has a personal obligation to do what we can in our own communities, or if we can help around the world, to build the positive and reduce the negative forces of our interdependence, to keep as many really big, terrible things from happening as possible and make as much good happen as possible, and not to be paralyzed by the fact that we cannot stop every bad thing and solve every problem, but to be seized with the notion that we can all make a difference and that ordinary people have more power to make a difference than ever before. You may not want to do what Molly did. You may not want to go to an African country and spend over 40 years, but you can all help people who do. We have a portion of my foundation is working on trying to reduce the threat of climate change, and one of our projects is designed to keep primal forests from being torn down. And we have 2 big tracts of land we're trying to save on Borneo, which is the home of the world's orangutans. There's a Lithuanian-American woman named Birutė Galdikas who lives there and is like Dian Fossey was to the gorillas in the myths, or Jane Goodall. In 1975, she was on the cover of National Geographic. Tall, willowy, long blonde hair. She looked more like she belonged on the cover of Vogue. Now, as she describes herself, I'm just a 70-something-year-old dumpy old lady sitting in a straw hat on a wooden bench. I'll never forget it. I met this woman, we were playing with these orangutans. They share 96% of our genome, by the way. And so Birutė looked at me and she said, I like you better than I thought I would. I said, why? She said, well, you don't seem like a politician. I said, most of us are also people. And we were talking, and she said, you know, I know a lot of people look at me, they see this little wooden shack I live in out here in the forest. They see the orangutans swinging around and they think, what a sad old woman. And she said, I am the most fortunate of people, for I have lived exactly the life I wanted. If you have choices in your life and you have the courage to live exactly the life you want, chances are you won't want to go to war. Chances are you won't want to kill somebody else because they happen to be gay. Chances are you won't think much of the terrorist organization trying to kidnap young girls out of your village. Chances are you'll help to stop human trafficking. And if you don't have those choices, the chances that you will become either a victim or a victimizer go up. And so what I wanted to say today is I'm grateful that when I was president, time and circumstance made it possible for me to end some terrible abuses of human rights. I'm heartbroken whenever I think of the opportunities that I could have had and didn't seize. I'm grateful that after I left office, I had enough physical strength and enough friends that we were able to do what's been done by the good people that work at the Clinton Foundation, the Global Initiative, and our Health Access Initiative. I do want to say I was thrilled that Tostan got this award, because I think building the capacity of local people to help themselves is the single most important thing you can do in the world today. We had 4 people with our health initiative that never left Liberia when the Ebola epidemic struck. And our Clinton Global Initiative partners raised in 4 trips 500 tons of medical supplies to go to those countries to help them fight it with no government money. People just gave and gave and gave. But nearby in Nigeria, when an Ebola case emerged in the Lagos area, the wealthiest part of the country, only 19 people died. 13 people. Why? Because the public health system they had knocked on 19,000 doors in 4 days, identified all the people who might be at risk, quarantined them, and treated quickly those who were ill. In other words, all those thousands of people who died could have been tens of thousands. So a lot of good was done. But if they had had a system that operated properly, their numbers would have been far lower. Nigeria has more than 120 million people. Liberia, less than 4 million. That's what we're facing, those of us who work in extremely poor places. So I think it is the empowerment of people to take care of themselves is sometimes the most important human right you can grant. In a few weeks, I'm going back to Central America and Peru to look at some of the things we do. And one of my favorite projects is done through a partnership we have with a Canadian philanthropist named Frank Justra and Carlos Slim's foundation. It's called Shakipi. And it's sort of like, I always say, it's kind of like Amway for country people. Because what we do is give these Incan women who live in remote Andean areas consumer goods on consignment, which they carry in backpacks to these remote villages and sell, and they come back and dump what they've got left and turn in the money and get paid. Every one of them is earning the first wage they've ever gotten. And after 2 years, we've not lost a tube of toothpaste because of the empowerment it feels. And it feeds. And I could give you lots of other examples. There are farmers, almost half of whom are women in Africa, most of whom are farming an acre of land, many of them with nothing more than a handheld hoe, have on average tripled their incomes by simply working with other people. It reduces the impact of conflict. In northern Nigeria, where Boko Haram is particularly strong, the poverty rate is over 70%. It's the poorest part of the country. And children were dying like flies before their 5th birthday of diarrhea and other waterborne illnesses. Their lives can be saved for 50 cents. A simple packet of oral rehydration therapy and zinc. So our Health Access Initiative is up there in those villages. When you think that all is lost, I'll tell you this story, just remember this. When I was president, I tried and failed to save a human rights and environmental activist's life in Nigeria named Ken Wiwa. He was a hero to the environmental movement and to human rights. The then ruler of Nigeria executed him. Today, his brother, who became a distinguished college professor in Canada, came home to run our health program in Nigeria. And none of our workers have been attacked in northern Nigeria for trying to save the lives of poor people. That's a human rights issue too. So, do I believe in the International Criminal Court? You bet. Do I support all these efforts to end human trafficking? I do. Am I glad for the places that I was able to help make peace and the places where we started that are still working on it, like Colombia, where we may, knock on wood, finish this year? Yes. But don't forget, the ultimate answer to the human rights problem is getting over the desire that you ought to control or demean somebody else's life because they're different from you. That people are no different than a corn stalk you can pick for whatever purpose you desire. It is about the empowerment of people in an interdependent world to share the future. Our future in America depends upon our ability to develop at home and promote around the world inclusive economics, inclusive societies, and inclusive politics. Fewer them, more us. That is the ultimate human rights challenge everywhere. So I leave you with this story. I was invited by both the government of Bosnia and the government of the United States to represent our country with a delegation, a bipartisan one, which included the Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen from New Hampshire and Madeleine Albright, my Secretary of State, and Republican Senator Roger Wicker from Mississippi, whom I asked to go to Bosnia 20 years ago, and Republican Congressman Peter King from New York. We went to observe the 20th anniversary of the slaughter of Srebrenica, which triggered everything else, including the peace. There is on the hillside at Srebrenica a massive gravesite. And whenever the remains of any person killed, of the 8,000 on that day, are found and DNA tested and identified, they are then buried in a respectful Muslim ceremony because the victims were Bosnian Muslims. On the 20th anniversary, outside there must have been 95 degrees. There's a big tent set up within which the religious leaders, the imams, were holding the ceremony. And everybody else was just out on the hillside. But the official ceremony was conducted inside a big open building that looks like buildings that all of us have seen in those fast action movies. It's an abandoned battery factory. On that awful day 20 years ago, hundreds and hundreds of the people who were killed were murdered in the battery factory. It became an abattoir. On this day, there were 700 or 800 of us from all over the world sitting there to commemorate the event. And the mayor of Srebrenica stood up, 36 years old. And this is what he said. He said, "I am the accidental mayor because I am the accidental survivor. 20 years ago, my father and brother were killed, and every single male classmate I had was killed in those hills. I have no idea why they never found me. But ever since then, I have thought I had to do something to make my father's life, my brother's life, my classmates' lives worth something." So here we are observing 20 years. And then he did an astonishing thing. He introduced the Prime Minister of Serbia, a successor of the infamous Slobodan Milosevic, himself under 40. He was 39, as I recall. He said, "I don't want anybody to be mean to him. I invited him here. We are neighbors. We must become friends. We have to build the future together. We have got to put this behind us." No one inside could breathe. Unfortunately, the people outside hadn't heard it. So when we walked outside, all the older Muslims were happy to see me because the United States saved them. The younger men were vacant-eyed because they didn't remember. I just looked like another old gray-haired guy. And because they don't have jobs. And then someone recognized the Serbian prime minister, and they started throwing things at him. And they had to navigate through thousands of people. It went hot. They didn't know. No one had told them that the mayor had invited him. No one had read the script to them. They reacted the way too many people on planet Earth do when confronted with someone they assume is the other. They didn't stop to think, it must have taken a lot of guts for this guy to show up. I mean, he didn't have to come. But it all settled down, and when it was over, the leaders of Bosnia apologized to him, and he said, it's okay, I completely understand what happened, and I'm still glad I came. In other words, not only the mayor who had lost so much, but the prime minister who had been assaulted could both see tomorrow through the weeds of yesterday. And in doing so, they stood up for human rights, just like Mandela did when he put the leaders of the political parties who had imprisoned him in his government. Just like the Rwandans did when they said, we don't have time to build a prison network. Everybody but the mass murderers wanted by the International Criminal Court can just go home and tell people what they did, and they have to do up to 3 years of community service. And they also said, by the way, that so many men had been killed they couldn't afford gender discrimination anymore. And now 56% of their parliament is female, the highest of any country in the world. Getting over this, embracing human rights, is not just good for the soul, although it is. It's good for the strength of order. It's good for turning back terror. It's good for economics. We have to build a shared future. The only question is, what will be the terms of the sharing? Will somebody be here 20 years from now lamenting the fact that we shared more closely than ever before, several more living hells? Or will somebody be here 20 years from now saying, hey, we thank the Dodd Center for helping us remember the lessons of human rights abuses and reminding us of the potential of human rights injustice, of building a future together, of living together, of more us and fewer them. It is the great question of the 21st century. The end of the Cold War turns out to have primarily benefited us by removing the specter of immediate nuclear annihilation, but forcing us to confront long, papered-over differences that had never been resolved. Nobody's in the cheap seats anymore. Everybody's got to step up. And the internet giving, the whys of non-governmental organizations, everything around you permits every one of you to be a human rights activist. Once you have the power to do something, you are saddled with the responsibility of your action or inaction. Just like I will always be responsible for the things that I did and the things that I didn't do. We're all in the same boat now, and it's a wonderful thing. I don't care what you read in the headlines tomorrow, there is way more good than bad in the 21st century. But we have to figure out a way to share our opportunities, to share our responsibilities, to be in a community where we think our differences are interesting and profoundly important and necessary to growth. Nobody's right all the time, but that our common humanity matters more. Most important book I have read on this subject in the last 10 years was written by a Nobel Prize-winning microbiologist, E.O. Wilson. He won 2 Nobel Prizes, I think, for his study of ants. What does he know about politics? Professor Wilson is the first person who told me in one of his books that the combined weight of all the ants on Earth exceeds the combined weight of all the people on Earth. A lot of ants. When my daughter and I were in Kenya at the elephant preserve that is part of our network of trying to save the African elephants, I saw three ant hills that were between 5.5 and 6 feet tall. One of them had been built under a shade tree, and they stopped building when they got to the branches that were leafy, so as not to mess up the shade. Wilson says if you study all of life on Earth, on the available evidence, you have to conclude that ants, termites, bees, and people are the most successful species because they are the ones that have persistently eluded things which could have destroyed them. He said, now, ants, termites, and bees are truly amazing because as far as we know, they have no consciousness or no conscience. They just evolved to do these things. People, however, are different. They have far more potential because they have consciousness and conscience. But they think they're smarter than they are, our species. So we are also prone to self-destruction. We keep pushing ourselves right up to the brink, denying global warming, denying what the Nazis were doing until it was almost too late, denying this, that, and the other thing. He said, but in the end, we always seem to pull it out. And he said, I've spent most of my life warning people about the terrible things we're doing, destroying species at the most rapid rate in 10,000 years. But he said, on balance, I'm optimistic because our conscience kicks in, moderates our consciousness, and we do what it takes to go on. That's what the human rights revolution is all about. 20 years ago, one of the 2 or 3 most consequential speeches that occurred in my presidency was when Hillary went to Beijing and said, women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. Today we say that about gay rights. I was at West Point last night, speaking to the Corps of Cadets, talking to the commander, a lieutenant general, very old-style looking general, and I had known him as a young officer. He set up the civilian police force in Haiti 20 years ago, and he said, you know, it's amazing. He said, the Corps is now 22% female, 15% African American, heavily represented are Latinos, Asians, people of other ethnic groups. And he said, the most amazing thing, however, was when we dropped the gender, the sexual orientation requirements, and we started admitting gays and lesbians. He said, it was the biggest non-event in my military career. He said, because these young people are so over it. And it turned out all of the senior officers who've been tippy-toeing around, what is this going to do to unit morale, were just wrong. He said, I'm here, I see it every day. And he said, this diversity has made us stronger, more American in the best sense, more respectful of human rights. So I leave you with that. You live in a country that has never been perfect, but seems always to be stumbling in the right direction. You live in a world full of bad news. Don't lose the good news. You live in a world where ordinary citizens have more power to do public good as private citizens than any generation ever because of the internet, social media generally, and the explosion of non-governmental organizations like this fabulous one you have honored tonight. You all have the power to be soldiers for human rights. In the spirit of Thomas Dodd, his wonderful son, their family, and that legacy, I urge you to use that power. Thank you, and God bless you.